We've already discussed the journey of one gifted martial arts dancer, so now we are pivoting to his contemporary, Steven Seagal. He used to be a massive box office draw, a huge fan of snapping limbs on screen, and absolute living proof of cosmic expansion. The guy skyrocketed to superstardom practically overnight, only to plummet right back down into the bargain bin of direct-to-video garbage. It really did not have to end up like that, honestly. So, what exactly fueled his initial ascent up the Hollywood ladder? What specific motion picture completely derailed his professional trajectory, and how did he manage to disrupt the Die Hard franchise? Why do his classic action sequences make John Wick look like a tame playground scuffle? And what bizarre circumstances led to him getting completely edited out of a feature film he actually starred in? Stick around and watch this breakdown to uncover the whole crazy truth. Way before he ever set foot in the American entertainment industry, this guy was thriving socially, financially, and professionally. His very first taste of movie production actually happened overseas while he was residing in Japan. Back in 1982, a martial arts mentor vouched for his skills with a katana, landing him an expert consultant gig on a flick called The Challenge. He did not just map out the on-screen combat, but he also dragged his own dojo pupils onto the set to work as background actors. Not long after that experience, he packed up and relocated to Los Angeles. Perhaps he figured that parking his training center right next door to major studios would score him another sweet consulting job. Staying adaptable and letting opportunities manifest naturally is a core principle of Aikido, and that mindset definitely paid off. By 1983, he was actively shaping the hand-to-hand brawls in a rogue James Bond project. That movie was Never Say Never Again, which famously featured Sean Connery stepping into the legendary spy's shoes for the final time. It is tough to say what his ultimate endgame was when he established his martial arts academy, but his actual future turned out wilder than any pipe dream. Out of nowhere, a guest dropped by the facility and watched him effortlessly toss his trainees across the mats while maintaining an absolutely icy glare. That spectator immediately realized this intense dude needed to be put on camera. He wanted the general public to witness this spectacle, hoping to captivate audiences worldwide. As fate would have it, that random observer was actually Michael Ovitz, one of the most powerful talent brokers in the business. The power player wasted zero time getting things moving, instantly financing a 5-minute demo reel for his new discovery. He marched that footage straight over to the executives at Warner Brothers, who were totally blown away. However, the ultimate clincher was an in-person demonstration staged directly on the studio property. The aspiring action star showed up with his loyal disciples and absolutely commanded the room by hurling them around the floor like weightless dummies while executing flawless techniques. He would later confess that choreographing this elaborate audition took several days of rehearsal, yet the payoff was astronomical. The corporate bigwigs were completely mesmerized, immediately offering him the starring spot in a 1988 theatrical release called Above the Law. Just like that, the legendary prime years of this ponytail-rocking brawler officially kicked off. While that debut feature did not exactly shatter global ticket sale records, it pulled in $19 million against a $7 million production budget. It easily recouped its costs and dumped a tidy profit into the corporate coffers. Considering the violent subject matter, you would assume reviewers were ready to completely tear the project to shreds. But shockingly, they were pretty kind to it. A solid chunk of journalists gave it a thumbs up, including the legendary Roger Ebert. Keep in mind, this was a mainstream picture headlined by an unknown self-defense instructor. What is even crazier is the fact that he was not the sole fresh face breaking onto the scene during that 12-month stretch. Right around the same window, Warner Brothers dropped Bloodsport, which introduced audiences to an obscure Belgian martial artist who also did ballet. Van Damme delivered a visceral performance, and despite operating on a vastly tighter financial leash, his movie raked in far more cash than Above the Law ever did. The executives had flawlessly tapped into what moviegoers craved, successfully minting 2 brand new cinematic badasses in the exact same calendar year. Riding high off that incredible momentum, our guy read the writing on the wall loud and clear. He shuttered his training center and threw his entire weight into the acting game. He was incredibly strategic about selecting his sophomore outing, desperately searching for a truly unique narrative concept. That cautious approach led to Hard to Kill, an explosive thriller where the protagonist takes a bullet, naps through a 7-year coma, and wakes up thirsty for vengeance. The crowd ate it up, driving the box office tally to roughly $50 million. They only spent $12 million making it, which translates to a modern $20 million investment, generating nearly $100 million today. Those are the kind of massive profit margins that would have Keanu Reeves sweating bullets on the set of John Wick. He kept the gravy train rolling with Marked for Death and Out for Justice, two adrenaline-fueled rides that maintained that identical, highly lucrative cost-to-profit formula. The latter pulled in a tiny bit less cash, but the dip in revenue was likely tied directly to the sheer, unrelenting savagery depicted on screen. It stands as the absolute goriest installment in his entire filmography, and arguably one of the bloodiest releases of 1990. To make matters crazier, theatrical audiences only saw a heavily sanitized cut, because tons of pulverized teeth and snapped spines were left on the cutting room floor. From a traditional storytelling standpoint, this is the exact moment where a massive flop or a devastating personal scandal should derail the hero's journey. You would expect the universe to course correct and halt his unbelievable hot streak. Instead, his subsequent project skyrocketed past all expectations to become his highest-grossing masterpiece to date, kicking off a fresh chapter often dubbed his Silver Era. Ironically, this monumental peak is exactly where the seeds of his eventual self-destruction were truly planted. It all started when Warner Brothers purchased a screenplay for $1 million from J.F. Lawton, the same guy who penned Pretty Woman. The original draft was boldly titled Dreadnought, and the ambitious writer had completely lost his mind, stuffing the pages full of atomic warfare, capsizing naval vessels, and enough explosive set pieces to launch debris into the stratosphere. Once the financial department crunched the numbers on that spectacular vision, they panicked. The money guys gently requested that he dial back the insanity so the shooting budget would not rival the cost of an actual NASA expedition. The storyline was heavily grounded in reality, though the working title stuck around during pre-production. In case you skipped history class, that term refers to a heavily armored, vintage naval vessel, perfectly teasing the concept of an obsolete boat going down in a blaze of glory. The studio dangled an unprecedented $5 million salary in front of our leading man, and he enthusiastically accepted the gig. However, securing the bag meant making a pretty traumatic personal sacrifice. Military regulations strictly forbade hair exceeding 10 centimeters, which meant the studio ordered him to chop off his beloved trademark ponytail. He fiercely pushed back against the grooming mandate, pitching a wild idea that his character was such an elite operator that the commander-in-chief personally granted him a permanent pass to rock long hair. The executives nodded along respectfully, only to aggressively mandate a trip to the stylist's chair anyway. The entire production was helmed by Andrew Davis, the exact same filmmaker who shot his big cinematic debut a few years prior. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, the director would constantly gush to the press about his star actor's insane martial arts proficiency. He continuously praised his tremendous evolution as a performer and celebrated his shift into a highly polished professional. Fast forward 20 years, and the guy was singing a dramatically different tune. In subsequent conversations with reporters, the director confessed he actively tried to dodge the assignment entirely, specifically because he absolutely dreaded collaborating with that so-called professional again. The only reason he ultimately signed the contract was the realization that his difficult leading man would only occupy half the screen time, keeping his on-set interference to a manageable minimum. Although the director opted to stick around, Pamela Anderson practically ran for the hills. She was incredibly close to snagging the primary female part before the martial artist completely torpedoed the situation. Based on her own accounts, producers reminded her that a massive line of hopeful women were foaming at the mouth for the gig, heavily implying she needed to tolerate some inappropriate groping from the headliner if she wanted the contract. She adamantly refused to play along and bailed on the project entirely. The lucrative spot ultimately fell to her Baywatch peer, the lovely Erika Eleniak. Contradicting her colleague's nightmare experience, the new hire publicly stated that the heavyweight acted like a total class act during production. Gary Busey, on the other hand, vehemently called bull on that narrative. He swore he personally caught the star attempting to trap the young actress in compromising situations on several occasions, forcing him to physically intervene and shut the creepy behavior down. So, we are left with a couple of distinct theories here. Either the blonde bombshell holds a shockingly lenient standard for chivalry, or her two vocal defenders were spinning complete fiction. Honestly, both of his detractors possessed solid motives to harbor a grudge. One lost out on a massive payday, and as for the eccentric supporting actor, their beef escalates into something legendary a bit further down the road. Principal photography wrapped up in 2.5 months, prompting the executives to schedule a preliminary screening for focus groups. The everyday viewers absolutely devoured the action sequences, but they universally trashed the original name. Absolutely nobody could figure out why a popcorn flick about a cook breaking arms was named after an antique battleship. To fix the confusion, they legally rebranded it to Under Siege. Back then, it held the bizarre record of being the priciest cinematic venture to completely bypass advanced screenings for journalists. The PR team operated under the assumption that snobby reviewers carried a deep prejudice against mindless brawlers. They feared that a movie headlined by the polarizing martial artist would get absolutely slaughtered in the morning papers, effectively tanking ticket sales on opening weekend. Hilariously, all of that corporate anxiety was totally unwarranted. The naval thriller racked up some of the most glowing write-ups of his entire career. It also morphed into an absolute financial juggernaut, securing a staggering $157 million globally on a $35 million budget. Organic hype propelled the feature into certified blockbuster territory, casting such a massive shadow that it completely derailed pre-production on the third Die Hard installment. Initially, the studio wanted Bruce Willis to rescue captured civilians aboard a massive ocean vessel. Since that premise sounded like a carbon copy of the Cook's adventure, writers were forced to trash the entire concept and start from scratch. Nailing 5 consecutive, undisputed victories at the multiplex is basically a Hollywood miracle. Honestly, that effortless string of wins probably accelerated his ultimate demise. By that stage in the game, the dude's hubris was completely out of control, fueled by an undeniable god complex. When you combine that level of raging narcissism with an already abrasive disposition, the resulting fallout is practically guaranteed to be catastrophic. Once that naval blockbuster stuffed everyone's pockets with cash, the industry's premier limb snapper convinced himself he was a visionary auteur. Unbelievably, 2 massive production houses actually bought into the delusion. 20th Century Fox and Warner Brothers completely fed into this guy's massive ego. Fox actually handed him the director's chair and the lead role in Man of Honor, plus a $30 million budget to creatively snap as many Italian mobster necks as he possibly could. You'd think that was a sweet gig, but Warner Studios countered with an insanely better offer. Grab whatever script you want, take a bigger paycheck, but you have to commit to the inevitable. Sequel for Under Siege, this project got the green light the second the original movie blew up at the box office. Steven realized he had the Warner executives completely wrapped around his finger, so he bumped the budget for his directorial debut up to $40 million and selected the script for On Deadly Ground. He kissed Fox goodbye, rolled up his sleeves, and quickly proved that being good at one thing doesn't make you a genius at everything else. The entire production turned into an absolute train wreck. Steven constantly rewrote scenes from the very script he handpicked, reshot massive sequences, and even threw punches with the stunt crew, pushing the final cost to $50 million. When On Deadly Ground finally screened for test audiences, viewers were literally nodding off in their seats. The initial finale felt like a bloated, extended cut from Lord of the Rings, where the climax is totally past, yet the main characters are just hanging out, throwing back drinks, settling down, and starting families. In Seagal's weird vision, Mother Nature played the hero. You had deer and bunnies prancing around, while dolphins did backflips out of the sea. Every living creature was celebrating because Steven had swooped in to save the day once again. Regular people, however, weren't quite so grateful. The flick barely scraped together $39 million at the box office, and it scored Seagal his very first Razzie nominations back in 1995. We are talking 3 separate nods here: Worst Actor, Worst Director, and Worst Picture. And he actually took home the trophy for Worst Director. Watching this absolute dumpster fire unfold, Warner Studios yanked the film from overseas markets just to stop the bleeding and dodge any more public humiliation. This colossal flop marked a massive turning point in Steven's Hollywood journey. He still had one safety net left though, because even after letting the guy play a gifted filmmaker to the tune of $50 million, Warner Brothers was somehow still down to make Under Siege 2 with him. Any rational human being would have taken the universe's giant hint right then and there, dialed the ego back a few notches, and focused on putting out a killer sequel. But not Seagal. That ship had absolutely already sailed. For starters, the guy couldn't even be bothered to hit the gym for the role, and by the mid-90s, his growing waistline was becoming impossible to hide. Rather than actually dieting or putting in the sweat equity, he literally strapped on a corset just to suck his gut in. On top of that, the action star had zero intention of backing away from micromanaging the production. Director Jeff Murphy brought up later that Seagal spent the entire shoot offering unsolicited, supposedly brilliant tips on how to properly helm a motion picture. Word on the street is that Hollywood heavyweights like Gary Oldman, Lawrence Fishburne, and Jeff Goldblum completely passed on playing the lead antagonist, specifically so they wouldn't have to endure Seagal's endless pearls of wisdom. Originally, the next Under Siege installment was meant to resurrect Gary Busey as a bad guy, even though his character basically became shark bait in the original film. One of the producers just got way too hyped over this wild plot twist, and went ahead and locked Busey in without ever getting Steven's blessing. The deal they inked was a standard pay-or-play contract, which meant Busey was getting his money whether he actually made it into the final cut or not. The moment Seagal returned from his getaway and discovered they did this behind his back, he fired both the producer and Busey right on the spot, reportedly handing the actor $750,000 straight out of his own bank account to buy him out. So, whenever Busey dragged Steven through the mud in future interviews, it's pretty safe to bet he was still holding a massive grudge about getting booted from the project. Let's not forget what a piece of work Gary can be, but honestly, Seagal still found plenty of ways to ruin things all by himself. First off, awful rumors started swirling that the female parts in the sequel were strictly reserved for women willing to hook up with the leading man behind closed doors. The actresses who shot him down were quickly fired, and they definitely spilled the tea to the press about it later. As if that public relations nightmare wasn't enough, hardcore eco-activists started gunning for Steven because, at one point during filming, he somehow decided that the natural scenery didn't look realistic enough. Without giving it a second thought, his crew literally painted the actual rocks a more realistic shade of grey. Whatever the heck that's supposed to mean. Conservation groups instantly slammed this stunt as an absolute crime against Mother Nature, forcing Warner Studios to quietly sweep the mess under the rug with a massive secret payout. Maybe the local authorities used that cash to scrub the paint off those boulders. Honestly, nobody really knows. Here's a hilarious piece of trivia. This movie was never actually conceived as a sequel in the first place. The original screenplay was titled Dark Territory and came from a total nobody at the time named Matt Reeves. Yes, the exact same visionary who currently runs the Batman and several other huge DC properties. Back in the 1990s though, Warner Brothers just bought his script off the shelf, slapped the Under Siege 2 logo on it, and aggressively rewrote the storyline to feature an invincible, martial arts badass, which is basically Batman riding a locomotive. The first installment carried a modest price tag of $30 million, but they completely doubled that amount for Part 2. If you adjust those numbers for modern inflation, you are looking at blowing $110 million on a basic action flick. You might wonder how they burned through all that cash on a seemingly small-scale story. Well, it turns out the massive train carriages you see on screen were entirely constructed from the ground up. These things were totally life-sized, fully operational, and ended up getting recycled for a bunch of other Hollywood productions down the road. Unsurprisingly, the post-production phase turned into another massive headache, with both the director and the editors practically begging Warner Brothers to intervene because Seagal absolutely refused to step foot out of the editing bay. Our incredibly gifted star wasn't just chilling on the couch throwing back cold beers. He was ruthlessly micromanaging every single frame, insisting the footage be spliced together exactly to his weird specifications. The studio executives completely ignored the crew's crying, so the theatrical release you actually see is 100% Steven's personal vanity project. Right before the premiere, they decided to tack the original script's name back onto the poster as a subtitle, officially dubbing it Under Siege 2: Dark Territory. Back in those days, throwing a punchy subtitle onto your sequel was the trendy thing to do, whereas regular digits just felt way too old school and boring. The picture hit the big screen in 1995 and instantly got crushed by Apollo 13. Houston, we definitely have a problem. In a matter of weeks, it completely tumbled out of the top 10 rankings. When the dust finally settled, the global box office haul tapped out at a meager $105 million. Had they kept the expenses in line with the first movie, that number would have been totally fine, but against a bloated $60 million budget, it fell incredibly short of breaking even. The studio executives probably recouped some of their losses once the VHS tapes hit the rental shelves, though nobody has the exact numbers on that. Usually, a massive Hollywood heavyweight like Seagal could have easily bounced back on his feet after dropping two massive duds back to back. His absolute saving grace should have been a project called Executive Decision, which was scheduled to hit theaters right on the heels of his train disaster. Unfortunately, things went off the rails so spectacularly that Steven was effectively written out of the very blockbuster where he was meant to be the main attraction. Back in the mid-90s, Warner Brothers stumbled across the screenplay for Executive Decision and aggressively swapped it for the Forrest Gump script, which happened to be gathering dust in their vaults. Looking back now, that trade feels like a punchline from a bad Saturday Night Live skit, but those executives were playing for keeps. Forrest Gump was viewed as a massive financial gamble. The story was rough around the edges. Pitching a hopelessly naive hero felt super weird, and industry insiders were betting it would bomb. Everyone basically wrote off the massive success of Rain Man as a crazy fluke in the system that somehow paid off. Executive Decision, conversely, was viewed as a total slam dunk, a high-octane thriller dropping exactly when action movies were dominating the culture. Plus, they had Steven Seagal attached, the biggest tough guy in town, eagerly champing at the bit to take the lead. Warner Studios didn't flinch for a single second. They tossed Forrest Gump over the fence, completely washed their hands of it, and dove headfirst into pre-production, while hunting for a laid-back co-star to balance Steven out. Just as the gears started turning, though, our boy dropped two historic box office turds back-to-back, On Deadly Ground and that terrible Train sequel. Since he just torched a small fortune of Warner's cash, the big bosses immediately got cold feet about pushing all their chips toward him again. After some frantic boardroom meetings, the higher-ups made the tough call. No way was Seagal going to carry this massive tentpole all by himself. Instead of grabbing a generic sidekick, they recruited a heavy hitter with equal box office draw to share the spotlight. That is exactly how Kurt Russell snagged the gig, riding high off his massive hit with Stargate. Steven, naturally, was absolutely furious about sharing the limelight. The minute the cameras started rolling, he threw his ego around set, picking fights with both the talent and the crew. The worst of his tantrums was directed right at John Leguizamo, who honestly had no idea if Seagal was being dead serious or just totally screwing with him. John would literally crack up laughing at Steven's insanely dramatic threats, which somehow left the martial arts master even more baffled and incredibly angry. One minute, he would just glare at Leguizamo like a total creep, and the next, he'd completely fly off the handle, screaming about what was supposedly so hilarious. This little behind-the-scenes nugget is basically the ultimate showcase of a very specific quirk in Steven's personality, but we will dive right into how that impacted his whole career in just a minute. Now, maybe the bigwigs at the studio would have just looked the other way when it came to his massive ego on the set of Executive Decision, just like they always did. Hell, they might have even given him a free pass for his recent string of box office bombs. But right around that same time, some intensely dark scandals started exploding all over the headlines. Suddenly, the tabloids were absolutely overflowing with Me Too allegations directed at Steven. There were even wild accusations that he was literally testing out his Aikido takedowns on his own wife. That was the last straw for Kurt Russell, who basically staged a mutiny and told the studio he would walk off the set right then and there if Seagal kept the lead role. Now, normally, a few years prior, Warner Brothers probably would have just completely ignored Russell's hardline stance. Honestly, they might have even just handed him his walking papers instead. But by this point, the executives were totally over it, so they hit the panic button and ordered an immediate, massive rewrite to just completely gut Seagal's character from the script as much as humanly possible. Steven definitely tried to throw his weight around at first, but he backed down real fast. The aging action star quickly realized that his contract with Warner Brothers still had a whole bunch of movies left on it, and if he dragged them to court, they could totally rip up the entire agreement. Since Seagal was incredibly desperate for new work, he essentially just swallowed his pride and dutifully filmed his characters, shocking early death, while all of his original dialogue got chopped up and handed out to the rest of the cast. The hilarious irony here is that the real winner was actually John Leguizamo. His screen time blew up in a major way, and that beefed up role totally launched his career to the next level. Let's be real, that absolutely never would have played out that way if the original script had just stayed intact. As for the movie itself, folks on the inside later admitted that it definitely took a nosedive in quality after those frantic rewrites. Slashing Stephen's role right out of the picture totally wrecked the entire pacing of the story, and a ton of movie buffs point to executive decision as the ultimate cautionary tale of thrown-away potential. But even as a watered-down mess, the flick still managed to rake in $122 million globally on a budget of $55 million, essentially just scraping past the break-even mark. Meanwhile, Seagal's name got scrubbed entirely from every single piece of marketing material, got completely axed from the opening credits, and was practically invisible on the theatrical posters, save for a few random European markets. To this day, nobody really knows if that disappearing act actually saved the box office numbers or tanked them. But giving Stephen the quick boot from executive decision definitely did not mean that Warner was entirely ready to kick their former golden goose to the curb. He desperately needed a career lifeboat, and the studio genuinely tried to throw him one with two back-to-back flicks, The Glimmer Man and Fire Down Below. But by that juncture in time, the writing was totally on the wall for Seagal, and Warner Brothers just was not about to gamble a massive chunk of change on The Glimmer Man. So, the studio ruthlessly chopped the budget down from $75 million to $45 million. Once that happened, Tommy Lee Jones sprinted for the hills, and his part basically got tossed over to Brian Cox. Slashing the budget like that meant a bunch of crucial action sequences and huge chunks of the actual plot just got tossed straight into the trash can, which, shocker, absolutely crippled the entire movie. To add insult to injury, Stephen had morphed into an absolute slacker at work, constantly, rolling onto set hours late and completely derailing the shooting schedule. The film crew had to just wing it half the time, which totally butchered an already terrible script. And if you thought The Glimmer Man bombed hard by pulling in a pathetic $20 million on a $45 million budget, then Fire Down Below straight up lit a massive fire under the asses of every single executive at Warner Brothers. Figuring that The Glimmer Man only tanked because they tightened the purse strings too much, Warner decided to bet the house on the next Seagal vehicle, dropping a whopping $60 million. That was the exact same astronomical budget as the Under Siege sequel, by the way, which was already a total letdown with its $105 million box office haul. It's a million. So did Fire Down Below make $105 million? Nope. Did it even make $55 million? No way. It scraped together a downright embarrassing $16 million. A huge chunk of the blame for that atrocious performance probably comes down to the fact that the movie looked insanely cheap. Just for some perspective here, The Matrix came out just a year later, cost only $3 million more to make, and it still looks like an absolute visual masterpiece today. And as the ultimate gut punch, Seagal actually snagged 4 Razzie nominations for this garbage fire of a film. After completely burning alive in movie jail alongside Stephen on Fire Down Below, Warner Brothers finally decided to smash that pause button. They likely realized that moviegoers desperately needed a breather from him, and that the washed-up actor needed a serious timeout before trying again. That next team-up actually took 4 whole years to get off the ground, and during that massive gap, Seagal's only half-decent project was The Patriot, which was a bizarre flick where he actually acted opposite his own kid. Finally, in 2001, Warner Brothers pushed out the absolute last Seagal movie they were legally obligated to make. Exit Wounds was backed by Joel Silver, the legendary producer who brought us Lethal Weapon and Die Hard, and it was helmed by Andrei Bartkowiak, the exact same guy who would eventually bless us with Doom. The actual budget for this movie is honestly a huge question mark, as some Hollywood insiders swear it cost $33 million, while other folks double down and insist it was $55 million. That gap is a massive deal, considering the flick ultimately pulled in $80 million. If the budget actually was $33 million, then it was a genuine smash hit, giving Stephen his first real win in nearly 10 years. But if it was, hovering around that $50 million mark, well, that paints a completely different picture. Since everybody in the industry was hyping it up as Seagal's epic return to form and a total surprise blockbuster, the studio probably at least made their money back. And right then and there, or maybe even a tiny bit earlier, Steven genuinely had a golden ticket to completely resurrect his acting career. Imagine if he had just taken a page right out of the playbook of every other aging action hero and leaned hard into comedy for a bit. The ultimate proof of this is Arnold Schwarzenegger, obviously. Stallone even took a swing at it with Stop, or My Mum Will Shoot, while Bruce Willis was practically the king of mixing shootouts with snarky one-liners. And Jackie Chan? Well, physical comedy is literally his entire brand. But Seagal, on the flip side, either had absolutely zero sense of humor and couldn't take a joke to save his life, or he just flat out refused to try. Honestly, it was probably a mix of both. From what everybody says, his total inability to crack a smile was a massive running joke behind the scenes. At the exact same time, Steven completely threw his gym routine out the window, looking noticeably puffier on camera with every passing year. But despite packing on the pounds, he somehow kept casting himself as these ultra badass, dead serious, lethal weapons. Naturally, the audience saw right through that absolute nonsense and totally refused to buy tickets. Now, if he had just pivoted to comedy, being a totally out-of-shape tough guy could have been comedy gold. But that is all just playing armchair quarterback, because in the real world exit, Wounds ended up being the very last Seagal flick to ever score a budget over $20 million. After dropping that absolute 2002 disaster class known as Half Past Dead, his average movie budget plummeted straight down into the dirt, barely scraping together $6 million. By that stage, the washed-up star was completely banished to the straight-to-DVD bargain bin, churning out cheap garbage exclusively for the remaining die-hard fans of the globe's most emotionless Aikido fanatic. The lone piece of cinema featuring Steven that actually saw the inside of a movie theater during that dark era was Robert Rodriguez's Machete. Even though Seagal was definitely not the leading man, he somehow managed to finesse his face onto the promotional posters and actually drum up a little bit of hype for the film. Then, of course, there was that completely unhinged reality TV fever dream called Steven Seagal Lawman, which somehow managed to stay on the air from 2009 all the way to 2014. The whole premise was basically just Steven waddling around the swamps of Louisiana and the deserts of Arizona, hanging out with actual cops and supposedly teaching them how to use Aikido to bust criminals, or whatever nonsense they came up with. Crazy enough, even with a whole new wave of extremely sketchy harassment allegations circling him throughout the early 2000s and 2010s, the show was actually a solid ratings hit. A few TV critics even labeled the entire series as a totally accidental comedic masterpiece. Whether he was trying to be funny or not is up for debate, but for the last 6 years, Seagal has essentially vanished from the entertainment industry entirely. He actually packed up and moved to Russia, where he currently acts as some kind of special envoy for humanitarian relations between Russia and the United States. Given the absolute dumpster fire that whole situation is right now, it is pretty safe to say he is totally phoning it in at that gig, too, which, quite frankly, is the perfect metaphor for his entire Hollywood trajectory. Seagal basically won the lottery, skyrocketed to A-list status in the blink of an eye, and immediately let his own ego inflate to absolutely astronomical levels, basically figuring he could just coast on his reputation forever. Unsurprisingly, as a direct consequence of that laziness, he physically inflated right along with his ego. The guy showed absolutely zero desire or capability to evolve with the times, which is wildly ironic for a so-called Aikido master whose entire martial arts philosophy centers entirely on being fluid and redirecting energy. However, if we want to be completely fair here, it has got to be incredibly tough not to let the fame go straight to your head when your very first acting gig instantly turns you into a global superstar. When you look at it from that angle, Steven's spectacular rise and fall mirrors the exact same career path of a highly specific Belgian kickboxer who absolutely loved flashing his rear end on camera, snorted ungodly amounts of party favors, and basically drove every single movie crew totally insane. Funny enough, we actually just dropped a full deep dive video covering that exact dude, which includes the legendary tale of the real-world fistfight that actually went down between Seagal and Van Damme. Oh yeah, that totally happened in real life, and it is a miracle that the fabric of reality didn't just rip wide open. Anyway, that is going to wrap things up for today, so I really appreciate you tuning in. Go ahead and smash that like button, hit subscribe if you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane, and I will catch you guys in the next video.